Hey everybody, it's Dave here again with another rocket build. For the next few days I'm going to be working on the Estes Black Brant III scale rocket kit. This is a scale model of a sounding rocket originally developed in Canada, and is still, some variation is still in use today. Now, I'm going to show you in this particular build a few things that you can do when things go wrong. Because, first of all, when I moved this kit from my home to the lab where I put these things together, I noticed that I didn't bring the instructions with me. Fortunately, Estes has a big database of old instruction sheets, so you can actually download most of the instructions for their models, both past and current. But when I did that for this particular one, it's a little bit dated. So one of the ways I can tell this is because it's using a skill level 2 here, and Estes phased out their numerical skill levels and replaced them with their E2X, or easy to assemble, basic, intermediate, advanced, and so on. And so if we compare this to the package here, it's actually an intermediate rocket, which is somewhere along skill level 2 to 3. And the layout of parts is just slightly different. And that's the other thing I want to talk about today, because in most of these videos I always go through the parts list and compare them to what we have. And what I found was that I'm missing two pieces. Okay, and as I said, the parts list on this one is a little bit different as well, but it's mostly the same. The pieces I was missing is one of the launch lugs. So in this version of the model, instead of having one big launch lug like it shows on this older set of instructions, it was supposed to come with two little ones, and one of these would be placed at the bottom of the body tube and the other one about halfway up. And my package did not have the second little launch lug. Either that or it had it and it escaped and I didn't notice where it fell. And then the other thing that it has that does not show in these older instructions is on the engine mount. It's supposed to have two rings here, one of which is split, and it's supposed to have another smaller mylar ring that would go around this, and it just helps hold the engine hook in place. And that one was missing as well. Now, if I had purchased this kit in town at a local hobby store, I could have just brought it back easily and say, you know, pieces were missing, could I please have another one? But in this case, I bought these online, and I really didn't want to have to wait a week or so to get a replacement back. Now, fortunately, since I've been doing this for a while, I've accumulated a lot of spare rocket parts, and so I'm just going to go through and find myself some more launch lug material, and I'll replace the missing launch lug. And then for the engine hook retainer piece, I can either make one or find one amongst my rocket parts as well. So in this case, my missing parts were not showstoppers, and I can still go ahead and build this, and it's a minor inconvenience at most. Let's go ahead and go through the parts list here. So we do have a body tube, fin material, and mine have already started falling out of the basic sheet there already. We have two centering rings. Now on the original one that it shows in the older plans here, both of these were closed. In the newer version, it has one of these has a split through it so that this can lay inside. All right, and so we also have the engine hook. This is the engine block, not the ring that I was talking about that holds the retainer clip on. All right, and as I said, this is one of the launch lugs. Okay, shock cord, parachute, engine mount. Now this I've already taken apart. Originally this comes as one big piece of plastic stuff that has both the nose cone and tail cone all put together on it, as shown here. I had already cut this apart while I was getting ready to do this. So originally this was stuck on with a couple of waste pieces of plastic as they show here, and I've already cut them apart. Alright, so that should be everything except the pieces that I know are missing. We're going to need some glues, both plastic model cement and either wood glue or white glue. You might also want some gel type cyanoacrylate or super glue. Okay. Oh, and there's the decals. These are water slide decals that we'll put on pretty much the very last step. So I'm back with the motor mount assembly here, and again I'm working with these older set of instructions, and this, not because you're necessarily going to have a problem like this, but this is a good idea to show why this is actually an intermediate level kit, because it helps to have a little bit of experience when you do have a problem like this come up and you need to find a workaround for it. And what I've done is I didn't have any of the small types of rings that they were using for engine hook retainers, but I did have another centering ring. And so what this will do is we'll have the engine hook in here, and I won't be able to dry fit this yet because I don't have a hole in there, but that would go along there, and then we'd have one of the rings go down about halfway, which is going to help hold the motor hook in place. One will be up here on the end, and this split ring will be here toward the aft, and then the engine block, got stuck in there, will go in the forward end of this, like so. Okay, so that'll give us a complete motor mount again without any problems. And then the hook will go in there, and then this tail cone will actually fit in here, and then the whole thing will fit inside the body tube, alright, which I just scrunched down here. But it's made to eventually look like this at the end. So that's what we're going for. I'm going to do a lot of dry fitting as we go along to make sure that my changes here will all still work correctly within the rocket. So now that I've figured out some replacements, now we need to put this together. And again, we need some measurements on our tube here, and you can tell that this is an older set of instructions because it's all in English units instead of metric. Okay, so we need on one end 1/4 inch. Here, that's where the engine clip will go in, and then another mark at 2 inches. Where one of the centering rings are going to go, and then another mark at 2 9/16 inches, which actually is about at the end here. Okay, which tells me I need to check something. Okay, yeah, we do have the standard size there, but I'm going to leave off that last marking. And what it's actually going to be is where the back of the engine mount tube will, how far it'll go up into the body tube here. So I'm going to wait on that one just a bit to see how everything else works out here. And again, you know, I could have gone home and got the original instructions and come back and do this, but I kind of want to do this as a means of troubleshooting a model rocket kit that we sometimes have to do. Okay, so now what I'm going to do is, take that out of there. Now what I'm going to do is cut about 2 to 3 millimeter slot here, or about 1/8 of an inch for the metric impaired. Okay, so that's going to go in here. Alright, and then we had our marking right there. I'm going to extend that just a little bit so I can see it. Okay, so one is going to go down here. Alright, now this is where in the new instructions it has this split here. Okay, and then this one is actually just to hold the spring more in place. What this is doing is allowing more travel here of the clip, because if we just had this all the way up here, it would be harder to move this out of the way to change the motor without actually permanently bending the wire here. So that's really the whole impetus behind this kind of more complex engine mount, is to simply allow more travel. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'll mount this piece here, alright, and then originally the other piece went right here and just barely covered up the edge of the hook, and then this would be about halfway in between. Okay, so now I can pull this up like this, okay, and then the engine block will fit in this end here, and it'll actually stop up against the tip of the engine hook there. Okay, so then that whole thing will go in here. And again, since I don't have it glued, it's all kind of falling apart inside there. Okay, and then this piece will go on over it. Okay, and if we look inside, the motor mount here should just come past the constrictor here on the nozzle. In fact, you could even pull that out a bit more. It'll look more realistic in here, but you might also singe the edges of the nozzle here. So if you bring it out so that it's flush, then you've got more room. The other thing we need to do is we'll need to cut this notch out of the nozzle, and that will allow freer play of the engine hook there. Now for this step, we're going to need either some wood glue or some white glue. I'm going to use wood glue here as it dries a little faster. And so the first thing we need is a bead of glue around the lower mark here. So this is where the split ring is going to go on. Try not to get it on the engine hook itself. If you get a little bit on there, it'll pop free anyway. Okay, but I'm just going to move that around there and just even that out a bit. Okay, and then I'm going to take my ring, and you can actually open this up a little bit. Slide it up, and that will allow more glue to get underneath it. Okay, and then just squish that into place. Okay, now again, if you get a little bit of glue there, probably won't make any difference, but if you want to just clean that out a little bit with a piece of tissue or a paper towel. But then that'll pop free again because the wood glue doesn't stick well to metal. And then what I'm going to do is put just a little bit of masking tape around that to hold it in place while the glue sets. And you don't need to tack this down around the edges, just on the top there. If you got a little bit of excess glue, you can start making a fillet around this. Your tape may get in the way. And we can even this out later. Okay. And then I'm going to take, this will be the middle ring, and as I said, it needs to be about midway here between the other two rings, but it needs to go on second here. And so I'm just going to gauge that and then pull back a little bit. Okay, and then I'm just going to put a little bead of glue right inside the forward end. And this will have the engine block. Slide that right in there. Okay, and this may have a tendency to kind of go tilted a little bit, so you try and keep that even all the way around. Okay, and now smooth out whatever glue you can. Try and keep it off the tops of the rings there. And I'll let this set aside, and while it's drying, we'll start looking at the body tube and getting it ready for fins and such. While the motor mount is drying, I have now cut out the fin marking guide from the instructions. And if you don't want to cut up your instructions, you can just photocopy it and then cut it out. And I'm just going to wrap this around. Try and keep it as taut as possible. Okay, and then we got to line up the marking lines here. Oops. Okay, so those are aligned. Now I just need a little piece of masking tape or two here to hold that in place. Okay, and as we go around, there are 3 fin lines and 1 launch lug line. So I'm going to just make a little mark here at each side with a pencil. Oops. And on the one that's for the launch lug here, I'm actually just going to write a little L down here, as that will eventually get covered up with paint and such. And then here's our last fin line. Okay. And we can just slide this off and put it aside. Now in the instructions, they always say to use a door jamb or a door frame because that gives you a nice right angle there. I've got this tube marking guide that Estes makes, and what it is basically a door frame that you can detach and bring with you. And so it's got different lines here for different size body tubes. And so we just line them up. So I'm using this edge. And that launch lug has to go up fairly far, so I'm going to do it first here. And I'm going to run it, just to be safe, about 2/3 of the way up the tube. And I actually managed to miss, so it's a nice thing about pencils, they have erasers. Okay, so my launch lug line is right. Should I get it on there here? Okay, right there. Just draw that up. There we go. And then the fin lines don't need to go as far, but you do want them at least from the very aft end and then beyond where they'll actually be glued on. Okay, that way you'll be able to see where that tip goes. Okay, and we'll do the other 2 fins here. Alright, so I've got 1 really long launch lug line and then 3 shorter ones for the fins. Okay, Now this is new to the, or actually it's old in the instructions. The new ones don't show this. At least I don't recall them doing so. Okay, what they're doing is actually putting a layer of plastic cement into the aft end of the tube. And the reason for this is apparently so that it will bond better to the nozzle when it goes in. And there's always a problem when you're trying to glue plastic to paper or cardboard, is getting something that'll bind well to both. You could use gel type super glue for this, and I believe that's what the newer instructions show. But what they're doing here is by making a thin layer of plastic cement right at the end here, and then letting that dry, it gives a plastic-like surface that this will bond to. So I'm going to go ahead and do that just because I hadn't tried it before. They show using the tube type plastic cement, which is a bit thicker. I'm guessing that the flowable type would work even better than that. This is what I've got handy. So what I'm going to do, and this is coming out really thick, and I know we don't want it that way. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is not try and go all the way around with it. Now I'm going to just take a little dowel here and use that to squeegee it around so that I make a nice film in here. Okay, so let's see if you can see that. There we go. Okay, so, and this, I'm going up about 2 to 2.5 centimeters here. Because I had a lot of glue, and it's actually better to thin that out than to have big lumps in there. And it shouldn't cause any problems like that. You might, one of the centering rings may still be on the surface there. So if you can, don't use quite as much glue as I did. And now we're going to let that dry. And then that'll give us a smooth, more or less non-porous surface that we'll be able to put the little nozzle in later on. Okay. Their next step that they show is actually to put the shock cord mount in. I'm going to wait on that a little bit, just so we don't have shock cords flopping around when we're trying to do other work. Next thing I'm going to do here is on the nozzle. As I said, this notch here needs to be cut out so that the engine hook can bend out of the way freely. And so now when this goes in over the end of my engine mount here, which is still drying, all right, this is going to fit here, about like that. And so this will provide some more room there for the, let's see if I can take this off. Yeah, okay. So that can only go up that far. Okay, so that'll give us a little play, maybe not as much as I'd like, but it'll still work. Okay, so when, let's see, I'll make sure it's dry enough. Yeah, that's dry enough. I can show you. Now, still got the plastic glue going there, so for demonstration purposes, I'm going to use the forward end. So this is going to go in like this, and all the way up to there. Okay, now if I pull this out, okay, that's going to show how far I need to be on this. So this is where that 2 9/16 inch mark they were showing is. That's what it's supposed to do, show you how far this is going in. So I can now tell that from this. And so if I take it into that mark, then this will fit in. Okay, so I can go ahead and take that out, slide this out just in case I got some glue running somewhere. Yeah, so that's mostly dry, and in fact I can go ahead and put in the fillets here around the rings now. And I'm going to use white glue this time just because the tip of the bottle is easier to control in those tighter spaces. Alright, so now my fillets are all in place. I can set this aside once more. As a kind of a trivia note, this model uses the same nose cone and tail cone as the Crossfire ISX. So if you haven't built that one before and you go to build it, you're going to see some similarities here, and vice versa. You've already had the Crossfire built. You probably may have noticed already that the nose cone and this little tail cone are the exact same pieces. Okay, so now we're still waiting on the glue on the aft end there. It's a little bit tacky yet, not quite done. Alright, so while the engine mount is drying there and we're still waiting on the body tube, we're going to get the fins out here. Like I said, in my kit, this one fin had already fallen out. So let's just stick that back there for a minute. And what I'm going to do before I take the other ones out is just give this a little bit of sanding while everything's flat. And so use either a sanding block or a sanding board. This is a sanding tee. Just something that gives you a flat surface. You just do a little bit of evening this way, and I'm going to flip it over and do the same thing. Put that back. And this just gives us a nice uniform starting point. Okay, now in this case I can just touch it, it's coming out. This one's kind of the same way. If you meet any type of resistance though, just take your hobby knife and cut out the little tabs there. We've actually got a nice section of balsa here. I'm going to throw this into my used balsa pile and save that for fixing models or even creating new ones. Okay, so the next thing I'm going to do is just very quickly sand the edges here and take those little nubbins off. Now, in the original instructions that I've got here, and by original I mean old, they only show the actual scale fins. Okay, so if you're trying to build this to be as close to a scale model as you can, the original Rocket had these knife edge fins here, and that's what they're showing here. They actually sand a knife edge into these fairly far up onto the leading and the trailing edges here. The newer instructions give you an option for what they call sport scale fins, and this is where you're not trying to get maximum accuracy, but just to make a rocket that more or less looks like the Black Brant III But in this case, it gives you a little bit stronger fins. And what they recommend for the sport scale one is to just round the leading edge and then leave the trailing edges square. And the reason you might want to do that is if you get these really thin knife edges, it does give you improved performance. You'll probably get a few more meters of altitude out of it. But those are also weak points. So when the rocket comes down, if it comes down a little hard on a fin or something like that, those knife edge fins are more likely to crack or break. So I prefer to keep my models in one piece for as long as possible. I'm going to go with the sport scale fins here and just do the rounded edges on the leading edge. And you can do that in a couple of ways here. One is the kind of hand method where you simply kind of take an edge off on one side and a little edge on the other side. And just do that to round the corners off the edge. And then you can go back and forth like this. All right, turning it over as you go. And eventually you'll get a rounded cross section here, which I've almost got just by doing that. It needs a little bit more. You can also get something like this. Now these actually work better for bigger fins, but this is an airfoiling guide. It comes in a 3-pack. I bought mine from Apogee Components. I think other places carry them as well. I can't remember it says NCR on the edge of it there. North Coast Rocketry, that's it. It comes in a 3-pack for 1/8 inch fins, I think a 3/16 and then maybe a 1/16 inch fins. It's 3 common fin thicknesses. And what you do with these guys is the sanding paper fits down into the groove here, and then you simply put a little masking tape on the edges to hold that in place, and then you can run these through. The wider side is for the leading edge, the narrower side here is for the trailing edge. For fins this small, it's going to be just as easy for me to do it by the hand and estimate method rather than trying to set this up to do them. Alright, I've sanded the fins to have a rounded leading edge, and then I gave all the other edges just a light sanding to square them off, make sure we don't have anything sticking out. And now what I'm going to do is seal them. And if you've been watching some of my other videos, I showed this in the vapor kit. This is a polyurethane based sanding sealer. And what I do is simply dip the fins into this and squeegee off the excess material and then let them dry. After which you can sand them again, and depending on how porous the fin wood is, sometimes you can do this with just one application, sometimes you may need 2, occasionally 3. And you want to have something to dry them on, so you don't want to have them stick to a surface. I've got these little applicator handles that I'm using, and I'll use another one for squeegeeing here, so I'm going to pick one that doesn't have as much stuff on it. Okay, and now since I'm dipping these, that's why I'm wearing gloves. You can also just brush this on if you wanted to. This, for something nice and small like these fins, I found this is about the most efficient way to do it. Okay, so now I'm just going to use this dowel to remove the excess. And if you end up with a little blob of it on there, it just means you have to sand a bit harder, which I hate doing, so I try to get as much of the excess off of this as I can. Let's see, the 2 parts of model rocketry I like the least. It's sealing and sanding and painting. So maybe that's 3 things. Okay, so there's one there, and I'll just put it down. Still have a blob on it, so I'm just going to even it out a little bit. There we go. Okay, so these can sit and dry, and we can move on to another part of our assembly while those are drying. While the sanding sealer is drying on the fins, I've reached the point where the glue inside here is now dry enough that we can handle it. And my motor mount still has a little bit of softness around its glue fillets, but it should be okay to mount. So again, what we're going to do is slide this in, and the instructions call for the engine hook to be in line with the launch lug. So I'm going to stick that in line with the launch lug line here. Okay, now something that's happened, and you have to kind of watch this. The layer of plastic cement in there has increased the thickness of the tube just a little bit. So it's going to make this a little more tight. Alright, but the rest of it goes in fairly easily. And so this is going to slide up to the mark we made there. Alright, and I've not put any glue on it at this point. I just want to make sure everything fits. And then our tail cone is going to go on here, like that. Okay, so everything fits in our dry fit. And what I'm going to do now is going to pop that whole thing out again, and be especially careful here that we don't break open our centering rings. Okay, and so we need to put some white glue or wood glue fairly far up there, because it's going to go up about that far, and the glue is going to have to glue to everything. And so ideally it would spread evenly, and it's not going to. Most of the glue is going to end up around the forward centering ring, but ideally a little bit of glue gets on everything else there as well. And so what I'm going to do is put a fairly heavy bead of glue just past the layer of plastic cement that we had put in there. And normally I like to use wood glue for the applying the motor mount to the tube, but since we do have 3 rings that need to get glued by the same ring of glue that's going to be in there, I want a little bit more working time. By having this many contact points into one band of glue, we have the possibility that it might seize inside before we can get the entire motor mount shoved up in there. And so for this I'm going to use some white glue, and I'm going to use a long cotton applicator here. You can also use a piece of dowel or a Q-tip, something similar. It's basically just a really long Q-tip. Alright, and that way I can reach this up really far to begin with. And then what I'm doing is painting this back toward the ring of plastic cement that we put in there earlier. So the idea here is I don't want to get it really thick, but I want to have it fairly long so that we have lots of glue to bind on to our engine mount there. Okay, and this is kind of the moment of truth. Put that inside there. Okay, and push in. Okay, there's my flush mark, and I'm just going to move this back and forth a little bit to help seat the glue. Okay, and then back that off a little. Okay, and then for this part, ideally I would like to be able to put the cement in the tube and then put this into the cement as it pushes in. But there's not a lot of space left in there. First I'm just going to dry fit it really quickly again and make sure that I'm where I need to be. Alright, so we're not hitting that aft centering ring. And so instead I'm just going to take now some model cement. And I'm just going to initially put it around the very forward edge of this. And I don't want to get too much on there. This is going to be kind of a balancing act between having enough to hold it in place but not so much that it all comes squirting out the backside and making a mess. Okay. So now I'm just going to put this on. I'm going to wiggle it back and forth, and you can see where it's coming out of the edges there. I want to avoid that as much as I can. Okay, so I'm going to press that in, and now if I do this quickly, hopefully I won't get too much mess. Because what I don't want is a great big film of this coming up the body tube where it might interfere with gluing on the fins, nor do I want it getting down into this area of the tail cone where it's just going to make little blobs and look really ugly. Okay, so that looks pretty good there. I can set this aside to let dry again, and then we'll continue with our next step here, okay, which will be putting the fins on. And again, we can't do that until the fins are dry and have been sanded. So this is a good time to actually back up a few steps here, and we'll go ahead and put on the shock cord mount in our next part. Okay, so we have another small problem here, in that in the kit that I bought, the shock cord mount was actually printed in the instructions, and you just cut it out of one of the pages. In this kit, it was actually a separate little piece of paper that came in the little or the small parts bag, and so I don't have one. But fortunately, this is a fairly easy piece of technology to make. So the Estes shock cord mount is basically just a long trapezoid. I'm just estimating this. If you wanted to measure it, though, we can whip out our ruler here. So at the widest part, this is about 3 centimeters. And what I want to do is make this about 2 times that long. Alright, so I'm about 6.5, that's close enough. And down here at the other end of my trapezoid, I want to bring this in about 0.5 centimeter on each side. So about to there, and about to there. Okay, so now I can cut this out. Alright, so I'll just draw my cut lines here. And theoretically, you don't even have to have a trapezoid to do this. The idea behind using the trapezoid is that when you fold this up, it's easier than to put it into the rocket. It's basically less bulky if you have a trapezoidal shape here. Okay. So, and now we can just roughly divide this into approximately thirds. So it's 6.5 here, so I'm going to make it up here at 2 centimeters up from there, and then another 2 about there, and that leaves me a slightly longer piece at the top. Alright, and so if you're used to these Estes things, they're numbered like this. Okay, where you start with folding over the 1 onto the 2, and then the 2 over to the 3. And the shock cord itself simply gets glued in there. So here's our shock cord. And I'm just going to, initially I'm going to lay this here at an angle just to show how it goes in. Okay, and the reason to lay it at an angle instead of straight down is that way when this folds over itself, this part of the shock cord will lay next to the rest of it instead of directly on top. Okay, so now we can use either wood or white glue again. I'm going to use wood glue because it sets up faster, and this is not particularly time sensitive. It can just be folded up and stuck in. All right, I'm going to get a nice film all the way across this. Set aside my scrap paper here. And if you look at the actual Estes instructions, it actually makes it more complicated than it needs to be. They're sticking the shot cord on first, and then gluing, and then folding and gluing. All right, so what I'm going to do is just make it like this. Again, keeping it a little bit off center. And then I'm going to take my one and fold it over the two. All right, I want to squish the glue all around there. And then I'm going to take that whole thing and fold it over the three. Okay, and this is where that offset helps. So now I can kind of pull this over a little bit so that it's resting against the shot cord that's inside here, but it's not laying directly on it. Only here at the actual bend does it do that. Okay, so now I can pick this up, and this side is what's going to get mounted into the tube. And so first thing I'm going to do is just give it a little bit of a bend here so that it'll conform to the tube easier. So this is going to go in like this. Okay. Now if you decide, when you're making your own like this, if you decide that, well, that's a little bit too wide, it's not really, but it kind of looks that way. But I can just go ahead and trim this down a little bit if I need to. You can do this actually with any model. The downside, though, is the bigger that this surface area is, the stronger the mount's going to be. So you're looking at a trade-off here between how much space you've got and how much strength this is going to have. Okay, now this needs to go down, according to our instructions, at least an inch into the tube. And that's so that the shoulder of the nose cone will not bonk into this. My rule of thumb, or actually rule of finger, is stick it in as far as you can reach. And if your finger doesn't reach very far, you can even use the handle of a tool like this or a dowel. And so what I'm going to do now is take my wood glue again. We don't want this dripping, but I do want a good uniform coating here so that the entire thing gets glued on. We don't want to just have a patch here and there of glue. We also don't want big globs of glue coming out of it. Okay, and what I'm going to do here is I'm going to slide it in with the glue side up like this and just go down about as far as I can reach. Okay, so now, let's see if you can see this. Kind of. Okay, so that's fairly far down there, and now what I'm going to do is hold on here, flip it over, and now the anchor is going to fall against the tube here. And now I'm just going to, so now I am pushing down on the shot cord mount, and my other hand is directly behind it, so I can get good pressure on that and squeeze all the glue around so it's nice and even underneath the shot cord mount. Now if you get a lot of excess glue here, you can take a tissue or a paper towel or just your finger and kind of squeeze that out. But in this case it looks like I hit it just about right. So it's in there nice and tight and no excess glue coming out of it. Okay, so now we can set this aside, and at this point there's not much else we can do until we're ready for the fins to go on. I'm still waiting for the fins to dry, but one other thing we can do is prep the nose cone. This has a seam on two sides where the mold for the nose cone came together, and there's always a little bit of both a groove and a little bit of a lip along that. And so I can just take some fine grit sandpaper, this is 220, and just run it along that edge and knock down that excess plastic. Okay, now usually what happens is you can get most of the edge that's sticking out, but the little bit of a groove that's there is often difficult to get at. And sometimes you just have to do it as well as you can here, and then plan on filling that groove with a little bit of primer before we get to painting. You don't want to do this too much or you end up wearing down the plastic to the point that it weakens or even opens up. So an overnight has passed and everything that we've been waiting on is now ready to go. The fins here I have already sanded to remove the excess sanding sealer, and you can see a little bit of a shine to them. But most of that's been knocked down by the sanding, and so the shiny spots are the low spots that have been filled in. Some people may want to put another coat on at this point. They feel pretty smooth to me, so I think the paint primer will fill in any remaining cracks and nips and valleys and things like that fairly well. One thing to be sure of is to make sure you sand all of the sanding sealer off the root edge here, otherwise the glue may not bond as well. Okay, the other things we did last time, we have the shock cord mount in there, good and strong. And I also want to check my tail cone here. Okay, that's nice and snug, it's not going anywhere. Alright, and the engine hook there is also working nicely. Okay, so everything there looks like it's working the way it should. So our next task is to add the fins to the body tube, and the first thing I'm going to do is just move the shock cord out of the way here. So I'm just going to kind of roll it up and stuff it inside. Okay, and now for the fins here, note how the fin comes from the root edge and then it has a little angle here. This angle needs to be flush with the aft end of the body tube there. So just right at the line between the body tube and the tail cone. And like I've shown before, I'm going to use a little trick of applying glue to the root edge here and then sticking it on to the body tube, and then I'll pull it back again to allow the surfaces to become tackier. Alright, now I need to make sure I don't do this to the launch lug. So my launch lug line was here. It goes all the way up the body tube. The other ones are all fin lines. So now I'm just going to find my line, and since it was pencil, it's kind of faint. Okay, and now I'm just going to pull that up again. Collect a little bit more of that glue there. There we go. And I'll wait about 60 seconds for this to get tacky. This thing keeps trying to roll away. I'm just going to put a pencil there. Okay, now while I'm waiting here, I want to talk about kind of the pros and cons of fin gluing here. If we glue these one at a time and let them fully dry between each fin, we're less likely to bump something wrong and end up with crooked fins. However, if you put them on while they're still somewhat wet and then go to the next one, you may have the option then to replace a fin if it's out of alignment or something like that. So I tend to go for the latter, and so once these get just a little bit tacky and I don't have to worry about the fin flopping off, I'll go ahead and go on to the next one. Alright, so now I'm going to go ahead and put this back on. And now I really need to make sure that I have the edges where they belong. Okay, I'm just going to press down there. And the glue is kind of squirting up on either side. We will even that out with fillets later on. Okay, and now I just need to check that the fin is nice and straight and perpendicular to the tube. Okay, and you can see here I've got more glue on one side than the other. Again, we'll fill this in with fillets later on. It actually kind of bothers me a little bit there, so might be a bit too much glue. I'm going to go ahead and knock that down very carefully. And the advantage to using wood glue for this is that wood glue is a lot tackier. So now I can just stand this up on the end. And I'm going to go ahead and do the other two fins here, but I won't bore you with watching me glue a bunch of fins. So when we come back, we'll have all the fins on. Alright, so now we have the launch lug that needs to go in. And if you recall, this is a piece that was missing. Alright, so what we can do is take an extra launch lug here, and I just keep a package of these because they're one of the things that breaks more often on rockets. And we can either just place it up about here, which is where the old instructions that I downloaded show it, or I can cut this in half and do it the way the new ones did, with one down here at the base and the other one up around here toward the center of gravity. And that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm just going to take this launch lug, which actually is 1 inch, so it fits on my grid here just perfectly. I'm just going to cut this in half. Now the advantage to having two is that by having one down at the base of the rocket, it gets the full length of the launch rod to reach stable flight velocity. But if you only have one down at the base, then there's a lot of leverage being applied to it as things like breezes try and knock against this, and that can tear this off easily. Okay, so that's why we have two of them. One down here for maximum rod length, and then one further up to strengthen that. And by having it at the center of gravity, that's where forces against this are going to be centered, more or less. So that's what we'll do here. The procedure is a lot like putting on the fins, although since these are small, we can usually just put a little glue on them and stick it right directly to the tube rather than having to wait for them to get tacky. Okay, so I'm just going to squirt a little glue up here. Just even that out a bit. Okay, so this one's going to go at the base. Right there. It's a little bit crooked. Okay, I'm just going to leave that right there. Stand up straight. There we go. And then do the same. And you don't need to be exact on this. But I'm going to bring this up, we'll say exactly 6 inches, so right about there. That's just a little bit of glue. A little bit more glue. Now the key here is to make sure that these line up straight, and you can do this in a couple ways. One is you can kind of treat this like a gun sight, and so if you sight through one of these, the other should be perfectly in line, and the other thing you have to look for is that line you drew down the body tube. You can also, if you have a spare piece of 1/8 inch launch rod, you can actually use that. You can guide it through to make sure that these are in line. Now the drawback to that is that launch rod is fairly heavy compared to the rocket itself, and it's really easy to bonk things out of line again as you try and take the launch rod out. Okay, so I would recommend, if you want to be absolutely sure, is let these dry first after doing an eyeball sight, and then use the launch rod to ensure that you have good traveling between the two and it's not hanging up somewhere. My fins have dried, and now what we need to do is put on some fillets to reinforce them. These also help improve the aerodynamics of the rocket by reducing interference drag where the fins meet the body tube. So I'm just going to put a little glue in there and use my finger to fill that in. And then any excess I can put on the other side. There's the fins. Wipe off the excess from my finger here. We're going to do the same thing with the launch lugs. And here again, the trick is we don't want to get glue up inside the launch lug here. But we do want it all the way along it, so that they don't get torn off by a wind gust on the pad or something like that. And some people even like to extend the fillets so that it all kind of blends into the body tube. You can do that with glue. It's actually easier to do it with wood filler. This is such a small rocket, though. I think doing that is going to be a whole lot of effort for not very much return, either aesthetically or in flight. Okay, and that glue, excess glue there on the sides, can be sanded off again once the glue is all dried. The structural part of this rocket is almost done. We just need to attach the parachute and the shock cord to the nose cone. Now, in the instructions, it shows actually taking the parachute and permanently attaching it to the nose cone. And to do that, we need to remove this little bit of flash here. But be careful not to cut the actual eye of the nose cone here. Also, don't cut your finger. Okay. What I prefer to do is, instead of tying directly to this, is tie the parachute to a snap swivel. And this gives me the option of removing the parachute when it's in storage, or even changing the parachute out, so that if I've got really windy conditions, maybe I want to use a streamer instead. Or sometimes maybe I even want to use a bigger parachute if I want a longer flight. And so what I'm going to do here is just, first of all, make sure all of my shroud lines are the right length. And to do that, I'm simply grasping the very middle of the parachute here, and then taking the finger of my other hand and holding all of these shroud lines tautly. And now I'm going to gather that into a small loop here, and I'm going to pass those 3 loops onto the swivel side of my snap swivel. Okay, and then gather them all again so we've got one loop, and now I'm just going to pass the entire snap swivel through that. Okay, this is another one of those jobs, if you have little fingers, it usually goes better. Alright, but then I just move the loops down, and that forms a nice, neat knot around the snap swivel eye. And now, I can just snap this on. Okay, the size of the snap swivel is going to be determined more by your nose cone than by the parachute. Because even a little tiny snap swivel will easily handle the stresses put on it by a parachute of this size. But if you've got a nose cone that has a really thick eye here, you can't use smaller snap swivel. So in this one, this has got a pretty thin eye. I could have used a smaller snap here if I wanted. This is just the one I had handy. You can buy a package of about 20 of these for less than $2 at any sporting goods store. Alright, and then the only thing left is to attach the shock cord. And to do that, just tie a double knot here and then just put a little bit of glue on top of the knot to hold it, and white glue works for that. I'm not going to do it yet because I'm going to paint this, and when I do, I don't want the nose cone attached. I'm not going to go into the details of finishing and painting this, but if you want to use the illustration from the package here as a guide, one of the fins is going to be white. The entire rest of the rocket itself will be red. We've got a gray or almost a gunmetal looking nose cone here, and then the nozzle down here is going to be black. If you want additional help with finishing rockets, Apogee Components has a series of really good videos on sealing fins, priming the rocket, painting the rocket, and then applying decals. But I'm not going to do that here. So I hope you enjoyed building this kit and have a good flight in the future.